You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Speaking of 5-star reviews, we've had some really nice ones, I have to say. Mike, I don't know about you, but I've really enjoyed them. And my personal favorite is the one that compared you to Gandalf. As a huge Lord of the Rings fan, I mean, got to work on the beard a bit. But as a huge Lord of the Rings fan, I have to say it raises questions about who Geoff is, like Aragorn, maybe? Maybe one of the other wizards?
Well, I'm more of a Harry Potter guy, so Geoff is my version of Voldemort. Actually, well, he's at least in Slytherin, maybe, on a bad day. But actually.
Okay, next episode of Hotel Pacifico, we'll figure out where the sorting hat would put us, right?
That's right.
That's
well,
fantastic.
Checking into the hotel today, leaving his political baggage back at the office, is Kareem Allam. He's a co-founder of public affairs firm Fairview Strategy. And in 2022, Kareem did the double-double. He managed to get Kevin Falcon elected as the leader of the BC Liberal Party, and also led Mayor Ken Sim and ABC to a phenomenal victory in the city of Vancouver, where every candidate who ran under their banner was elected, which is something I'd never seen before. So that's not all. He was also once the roommate of Pierre Poilievre. So there you go. Kareem, welcome to the Hotel Pacifico.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Mike. Really excited to be here. Maybe I'm your first guest from House Hufflepuff. So we can continue on with the analogies from there.
Well, we are recording today on Halloween, and I want you to know, Kareem, I wore a costume for you. I am a political animal. There you go. And thanks to my clothier, Madam Premier. So did that just for you. But
Madam Premier is a great brand. I encourage everyone to check it out. It really, really is something incredible to see.
Started by a BC legislature staffer, Sarah Elder. So good for you, Sarah. Kareem, before we get into the politics of the day, I'm interested to know, what was your journey into politics? How did a guy like you, coming from another place in the world, end up throwing yourself into BC politics?
Like most everybody, I fell into it a little bit backwards. My grandfather was an ethnic Egyptian. I was expropriated in Sudan in the 1968 communist revolution with my mom and my uncles and my grandmother. They were refugees for a couple of years before their papers cleared to come to Canada. So politics sort of was a little bit of something that in the household I grew up in wasn't ignored. Something we paid close attention to. After my mom graduated from Simon Fraser University, she went back to Egypt and met my dad, who had served as a military officer. He fought in 1967 and 1973 in the Arab-Israeli War for the Egyptians. In 1973, he was captured by the Israelis and spent 11 months as a prisoner of war. When he ultimately went back to Egypt, he built really close friendships with Marwan Kanafani, who was Arafat's chief of staff, and Hassan Asfour, who was the chief negotiator in Oslo. And so, sort of being young in my 20s when I'd go back, having just the opportunity to listen to them and talk to them about the peace process and learn a little bit about their political evolution involvement really sort of challenged a little bit of my growth and my thinking about politics as well. In Canada, I've also had incredible touch points throughout my career too. The house that I grew up in Richmond was in a cul-de-sac. On one side of the cul-de-sac was former Minister Tom Siddon, and the other one was Art Kuby from Solidarity. Wow. Mary Kuby used to take care of me when my mom would go to work.
Two sides of the political aisle there.
That's right. So if Art Kuby and Tom Siddon can get along, anyone can get along.
That's amazing. So it comes to you through the family, through the babysitters, through the neighbors. That's right. Fantastic. It's interesting. You've been really open. I've seen you reflect publicly before on how much at that point in time, politics really was something that was, run by rich white people on the West Side. And at a time when you got started, in particular, when Islamophobia was really on the rise. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you've seen that change over the last, if you've seen that change over the last 20 years, and if so, how?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey the last 20 years of my time in politics. I'd say that we've seen huge progressions, huge leaps forward in the front rooms of politics, the front benches of the Liberal Party, the BC NDP, the BC Liberals under Christy Clark. We saw a lot of firsts into cabinet. With Ken Sim, we're seeing the first Chinese mayor. But yeah, for the most part, the back rooms tend to not be as diverse. I do look at this premier's office. It's probably the most diverse premier's office I've ever seen.
Notice that too. Yeah.
But that's not been par for the course. The back rooms have been predominantly establishment and white. And there's a lot of barriers to be involved in politics. It doesn't pay well. The jobs are infrequent.
No job security,
there's no job
bad
security,
hours.
bad hours. There's no pension. There's no
It can make
nothing.
Thanksgiving dinner really like awkward.
Or my last Christmas, which there was a garbage issue that ruined my Christmas dinner. But yeah, it's those types of things. So the barriers are definitely there and definitely real. And you know, I've been fortunate to have had a good career and some flexibility to be able to jump in and out. But yeah, the barriers are definitely there, and they're more obvious and more challenging in the back rooms than they are in the front rooms.
From the campaigns I've seen you involved in, you know, you've really sought to bring the various communities, South Asian community, Chinese community, Filipino communities, you name it, into the mainstream of the campaigns. And, you know, I see that you see the world a little differently compared to a lot of other campaign managers in terms of how you, I wouldn't say slice and dice, but, you know, how every community needs a unique approach. Like, what's your thinking on that?
You know, I think, you know, it's actually a little bit comes from you. You know, you'd always say, you know, at different events, at cocktail parties, that, you know, people who come out from outside of BC and try to run campaigns try to look at BC politics through a federal political lens. And I definitely see that that's a path for failure. I think part of your success in politics and part of Geoff Meggs' success in politics has really been defined by how well you truly understand BC and its makeup. Geographically, I don't think anyone knows the province better than you, Mike. And then economically, I think very few people would rival Geoff's knowledge. As we've seen, Vancouver.
This is not the advertising part of the show, Kareem.
No, it's not. But as we've seen the Lower Mainland become more ethnically diverse, I think 52% of Lower Mainlanders come from non-European households. That lens, that ethnic lens that I've had has become more important in terms of being able to understand the province. Also, the 10 years that I put in traveling the province, working on JVs with First Nations, gave me a chance to, maybe not to the depth that you have, but experience the province and understand that, you know, the coalition building that goes on in this province is very, very unique. You know, the history of the Green Party and its tie to Vietnam, that Liberals and New Democrats can get together and form a successful vision political party in Vancouver, or that Liberals and Conservatives can get together and form a strong NPA, that private sector labor and disaffected Conservatives could be the basis of the Reform Party. The coalition building is tricky in the province, and does take a deft hand, but increasingly it's impossible to avoid the ambitions of racialized people in this province.
So just to chase that a bit more in terms of campaigning, you know, outside of the you know, the white community or the Caucasian community, or let's call it the English speaking community, you know, what do you see as the key differences in campaigning when you're getting to the heart of Mandarin Cantonese speakers, or in the heart of Punjabi speaking populations out in the suburbs of the Lower Mainland? Because you can't communicate with those communities through the Vancouver Sun as effectively, or other mediums that over the years we've tended to lean on.
Yeah, the rules for campaigning tend to be the same. The approach might be different. The starting point, and you can use the ABC as the example, the starting point for the coalition that we were trying to build was ethnic. 62% of Vancouver, the city itself, is non-European. And the starting point wasn't to have ethnic be an afterthought, and it tends to be an afterthought in campaign planning. So, okay, here's what our polling's saying, here's what our focus group data is saying, and you build up the campaign. Okay, now what are we going to do for ethnic? Instead, we started our research in language to really try to get to the root of what's going on. Unless you're targeting Chinese, South Asian, and other racialized communities in your research, it's hard to really get those ambitions, and they tend to get missed. So some of the things that came up in our research around honors programs pulled extremely high in Mandarin and Cantonese communities. But when it sort of pulled in the broader community, it barely showed up. And the irony is that you had racialized communities going out and talking about how terrible honors programs were and how terrible school liaison officer programs were. But our polling and our research was actually telling the groups that wanted the most were actually racialized people. So that was one of those sort of hidden gems in terms of how we explain our election victory, in terms of how we tied research to actually delivering votes into that ballot box. So the rules are the same. It's just the approach is that it's got to be authentic. We built up a campaign team and recruited candidates that were reflective of the population of Vancouver, and let them carry their own messages from their own experiences and their own hearts. And it landed authentically because it was authentic.
So throughout that campaign to elect Ken Sim, you played a pretty prominent role publicly, Ken Sim and ABC. And there's a common wisdom that political staffers need to blend into the furniture and disappear. And picking up on socials, for example, you were really active on Twitter, kind of clamping back as the opposition, a bit like, I'm going to say, like West Coast Jerry Butts. So was that something you decided to do going in, or did it just happen?
It evolved. I do adhere to that orthodoxy that if your name's not on the ballot, keep your mouth shut. The challenge that, I started experiencing about halfway through the campaign is, of the 19 candidates who were running, 3 were incumbents and 16 had really never been involved in politics before. Again, when we went out and reached out to build that team that we wanted to be reflective, we went into communities where people weren't necessarily involved and engaged in politics. And so the learning curve, the media training curve was really, really high. And so there was this heavy reliance on the 3 incumbents, Sarah, Rebecca, and Lisa, for media. And you could start to feel as the campaign manager, I was losing my candidates a bit, because I'd always send those 3 out on the bad, tough issues, and all the good, easy, cheap, happy, we're going to have alcohol on beaches, and we're going to have more festivals and more parties and all the fun announcements. We're going to the less proficient. So there really wasn't a lot to choose from in the bench when we started getting into justifying the complexities of 100 nurses, or the intricacies of what staff memos we were talking about with regards to the road tax. And so I felt like I had to jump in reluctantly, but I had to jump in to take some of that heat off of the team. And it's
you were jumping in. You were jumping in as a spokesperson who was like speaking to the issues like that, which goes a lot further than most campaign managers usually do.
Yeah, I felt like I didn't really have a lot to rely on in terms of depth on the team to be able to spread it out. So, and typically, and occasionally, we've seen this before in other campaigns, you'd bring in your campaign chair. We didn't have one. We were trying to invent something new. So to bring in that, regal, thoughtful, intelligent, person, to chair the campaign took away from the fact that we were trying to present something new. So the concept of the campaign chair didn't work. So it did feel like it fell on me. Initially, I thought it was just going to be 1 or 2 interviews. As the campaign wore on and the attacks started to fire up, Initially, might have, people were just ignoring us. There was a 4 or 5-way vote split on the center right. But as things started to zero in on us, and as the polling showed that we were winning, the attacks definitely intensified and hit with more frequency. And it was just easier for me to take them on myself.
Was there a particular issue that made you take that jump? Was there something that flared up that you're like, I got to step in here?
No, the couple times that I tried to use people outside of the 3 incumbents. I just felt that the messaging was a little flat, and I also felt it was unfair to
Yeah.
throw a rookie candidate into the crossfire. And Vancouver does still have a very, very active press gallery. Like, that's not something that exists in Surrey or Richmond or in most other municipalities. And they're extremely well researched, very thoughtful, very intelligent. But I think they also appreciated coming back to me, just as a former policy director at the Vancouver Board of Trade, that I was able to get into the issue at a deeper level and justify the approach, particularly on the 100 nurses. That was a really, really, really complex piece of policy. I'd spent time as staff and then on the board at the Fraser Health Authority, had a lot of experience with the CAR 67 program, which is similar to the CAR 87 program in Vancouver, the ACT AOT programs, that full continuum of care that we were advocating for. The punchy 100 cops, 100 nurses, that's what the sloganeering was. But when the media really wanted to dig into the depth of it, getting everyone studied up on it to that level would have been challenging.
So next week, it'll be 1 year since Mayor Sim and ABC and all the councillors elected took office. And that was a very festive day. I recall being at the Orpheum watching the parade of personalities there. And you were obviously front and center. But now, 1 year removed from that, council's hit some rough waters. Certainly the tax hike around 10% was, I think, a surprise to some of its supporters. What do you think Mayor Sim has to do to hold the ABC electoral base together over the next 3 years, assuming that the lefties, the center left, are going to get their act together this time and not run 5 or 6 different political parties in a gazillion candidates splitting the vote on the left, that they'll be a little more organized this time?
Yeah, that's precisely it. If the left coalesces into one party, a new vision, a new one city, it's going to be a very difficult job for anyone to beat them. Vancouver is a progressive city. 9 of the 11 seats provincially are held by the NDP. 8 out of the 8 seats federally are held by Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh. So governing as a conservative in the city is not a path to victory. When we did our analysis post-election, we won 10 of the 11 provincial seats. 60% of our vote came from federal Liberals, 20% from Conservatives, and 20% from the NDP, which we chalked up to private sector labor. So governing from the center, keeping those Liberals happy in the coalition, advancing some of those social causes is going to be important. But ultimately, the measure of which any mayor of Vancouver is going to be measured on is going to be on housing. And the complexities of getting more housing online are not easily solvable. You have capacity issues with sewers. It's a 100-year-old sewerage system here in the city of Vancouver, and it's very expensive to replace. Grid issues with BC Hydro, a very complex permitting process, layering on of new building codes that add time to the construction of projects. But ultimately, regardless of what those challenges are, the public just wants to see progress. And the more that Ken can be seen doing, working with the province and working within his own department to get more housing online, is to the degree I think he'll be successful.
That right down the middle strategy, just to move it to provincial politics, is exactly what I think Calvin Falcon is probably looking for right now in this moment. Particularly if you look at the polls, which obviously you take with a grain of salt, but seeing the Conservatives kind of move in from them on the right. And then, it seems at this stage that Premier Eby's kind of moved into Horgan's shoes relatively seamlessly. John Horgan choose relatively seamlessly. Do you have any advice for Kevin Falcon on how to navigate that middle center row? You know, what's the path for him?
I don't know if I have any advice specifically or directly for Kevin, but what you've seen by looking at campaigns run by John Horgan and Glenn Clark and Christy Clark under Mike McDonald were very centrist, pragmatist campaigns. British Columbians, and that when you start in the center, as you coalition build, it gives you the widest possible berth to pull pieces together in that coalition building. I think British Columbians tend to not be super ideologically right or left, but they tend to be very progress driven. They like to see new infrastructure, new schools, new SkyTrain lines. Those aren't ideological issues. Those are the things that they want to see progress on. But yeah, it's instructive that when we started the campaign with ABC, there was this pressure internally to go to the right and try to snuff out the NPA and Colleen Hardwick's support. But the irony was, by staying centrist, by being broad tent, by showing that we could win, the end of the campaign, we were probably polling 7, 8, 9 points ahead of Kennedy. The NPA vote and the Colleen Hardwick vote collapsed into ABC because it looked like the best chance to beat Kennedy Stewart. So that conservative vote will come back to the BC United if they say centrist and if they can show that they can beat David Eby. But by pitching to the right and alienating federal Liberals who seem very content with this government, I don't see a path to victory taking that approach.
Well, let's talk about political rebrands then. BC United's rebrand has taken a lot of hits. You were part of a rebrand and a new political product that was more well received with ABC. Why did that rebrand work so well? Was it timing, hunger for change?
Yeah, I think tone, narrative are critical to campaign. So we wanted something happy and cheery, but something also slightly reminiscent, with a little bit of a 70s sort of touch. So it wouldn't be offensive to older voters, but accessible. Changing it to ABC really was from a better city, was really just driven by our desire to be accessible to ethnic voters. The day I knew we won the campaign was we had a rally at the Florida restaurant, and we had 1,000 Chinese people in the room all chanting ABC, ABC. It's the first thing you learn when you're learning English.
I was just gonna say, easiest acronym there is.
It is. Yeah. And I've been at the Florida for conservative and BC Liberal events, and conservative and liberal, they're hard words to say if you're not familiar with the language. So it made it accessible. But the real reality of why the brand was so successful is because of the sheer amount of money we spent. We spent close to $3 million on a city of 600,000 people. It was the most money ever spent in a BC election. We hear about agenda setting theory and comm strategy. Well, we set the agenda because we just bought the media. At the end of the campaign, you couldn't get ads on CKNW and 7 or 8 other radio stations, CHMB, Fairchild. Like, we just bought everything. And so that's ultimately
the voters got the memo.
The voters got the memo.
Yeah, that's a lot of resources,
and they haven't got the memo on BC United yet. Obviously, if comparing those rebrands. Yeah,
if you were just to do the proportional math on okay, we spent $3 million, about $1.5 million of it, $1.5 million on advertising. That sounds like $8, $9, $10 million that you're going to need to spend provincially to hit the sort of same demos. So the rebrand requires a tremendous amount of money to be successful, more than anything, and that's what we had at ABC that the BC United didn't have. But regardless of how you feel about Justin Trudeau and the federal Liberals, it is the Coca-Cola of brands in Canadian politics. And having been that conservative that's been organizing in ethnic communities, there's no one that's more aware of how potent that brand is in the Chinese community, the South Asian community, and the Filipino community. And so to just walk away from that, I didn't think was necessarily wise. But I also understand that the pressures and what the party itself wanted to do was change the name. And Leaders have to be very sensitive to their members. Otherwise, they don't last as leaders very long. So I'm sure there was a careful weighing of the pros and cons of each before the decision was made.
Well, let's talk about a repositioning of a different sort, and that's what's happening in federal politics. And your former roommate, Pierre Poilievre, yeah, he's taken a different approach. Definitely not going to the center. He's kind of bringing forward a muscular form of conservatism that's firing up the base, throwing red meat, and they're gobbling it up, on the conservative reaches of Canada. Obviously, there's a thirst among them for time for change. That's fueling part of that. But the way he carries himself is very different than a leader that you supported, I believe, in the previous leadership, Aaron O'Toole. So with him taking that different approach than, say, Kent Sim took, or, Kevin Falcon might take, yet he might still prevail out here in BC. Like, how do you square that in terms of that approach working as a recipe for success in BC and Canada?
Yeah, there's been different iterations of successful conservative elections. There haven't been a lot in comparison to federal Liberal ones. Harper definitely took the party in a direction where he wanted to appeal more to those Laurentians. Pierre's rejected that, and he's trying to appeal to private sector labor. And I think it's working. I'm surprised at the number of maybe not labor leaders, but rank and file members that I run into that are very strong historical NDP voters that find a lot of appeal in that message. So nothing that Pierre ever does is by accident. It's very well thought out. It's very well researched. It's very well tested. But I also think it's authentic to who he is, and it's working. So a combination of that time for the change, but then also trying to appeal to that average person. And let's face it, there's a lot of economic headwinds out there. People are struggling, and people are looking for something new. And he does seem to be hitting those notes, at least on the economic message, really, really, really well.
Did he pay his rent on time by any chance?
Yes, he was extremely thoughtful and
Did he do the dishes? Like
No socks on the floor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, though he's actually extremely tidy person. Very very empathetic, very generous, very kind. You might not agree with his politics, but it's very difficult to find flaws with his character.
Well, he certainly likes eating apples, that's for sure.
That is going to be a well-studied video for many years.
Well, Kareem, this has been a great conversation today. We appreciate you stopping by the Hotel Pacifico. Please take some mints on your way out the door. And we hope to have you back sometime to continue the conversation.
I hope to check out but never leave. Thank you so much for having me.
If you're like me and you had the Latin root for fungi seared into your brain while binge watching The Last of Us earlier this year, allow me now to begin rehabilitating the reputation of the humble mushroom and all its often delicious, sometimes infectious cousins with a story about a company called Mycocycle. Mycocycle uses fungi to convert construction waste destined for the landfill into raw materials that can be manufactured into new products used in packaging and construction. It's a game changer for the roofing industry. When you remove a roof, you have a lot of trash, not just any trash, but construction and demolition debris. Until now, the roofing industry and other asphalt and chemical manufacturers have not been able to achieve zero waste because the products manufactured were ultimately contaminated with toxic components. Mycocycle can fix that. It's a PR win for mushrooms, a boost for the circular economy, and just one of a growing number of success stories out of TELUS's Social Impact Fund. The TELUS Pollinator Fund for Good is one of the world's largest corporate social impact funds, investing in for-profit companies and founders whose core business seeks to make the world a better place. The Pollinator Fund invests into early-stage for-profit companies where impact is baked into its business model. It supports tenacious, mission-driven, and diverse founders by leveraging TELUS's broad network to make introductions, open doors, and guide the portfolio of companies to maximum growth and impact. Leveraging TELUS's global leading technology, resources, and network, Pollinator invests in sustainable solutions that can generate meaningful and measurable social impact and a financial return. Measurable impacts like mycocycles, which avoids almost 3 tons of carbon dioxide emissions for every ton of waste diverted from landfills. I wish I could have diverted my attention from that scene at the end of episode 2 with the wiggly mushroom tentacled zombie kiss. I love that show, but I can't unsee that.
Hello, you've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
We have a clipping this week. This week in the Strategy Suite, we'll be discussing a clipping that grabbed our attention. Vaughn Palmer in this Vancouver Sun this week gave voice to some exasperation, consternation that was telegraphed in the BC government's reaction to the federal flip-flop on the carbon tax, carving out special consideration for the Atlantic provinces and pretty much no one else. Geoff and Mike, any sense of what the thinking was from Ottawa on this one?
I don't know there was much thinking. And what I was told from people who know these things is that it was a very improvised Ottawa decision, perhaps only finalized the night before, probably in a series of tumultuous meetings with Atlantic MPs that didn't take into consideration any of the fallout that we've seen since. And so it came as a complete surprise to British Columbia and to everybody else, frankly. So there wasn't a lot of thinking. I think those who say that it was intended to try to improve the Liberals' chances in Atlantic Canada are correct, but it may have opened a can of worms that they'll never be able to get screwed shut again before the election. So very problematic too for the NDP government here in BC, because they're going to the polls before Prime Minister Trudeau does, unless there's some change in plans in Ottawa, and had a pretty good course ahead, they thought, I think, on carbon tax, and now that may be in peril.
Well, there's a bit of, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to pile on there. There's some nervous backbenchers and probably cabinet ministers as well from Atlantic Canada, where, you know, affordability issues are front of mind, and the carbon tax agenda has never been as hasn't resonated as much in Atlantic Canada as it has in the major urban centers and the rest of, you know, Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver. So they're feeling the pressure, and Poilievre has been out there rallying his troops, and I can only guess they were starting to see some movement, and there was a strong lobby from the Atlantic Caucus to do that. And the problem it creates is, well, okay, there's a carve out for Atlantic Canada. Now people can pressure their MPs in the 905 or their MPs in the suburbs of the Lower Mainland or anywhere else. There are Liberal MPs and say, well, what about us?
Yeah. I mean, to pick up on that point, though, and both of you hit on it, right? This idea of like winning votes in the Atlantic provinces. I mean, it's through that lens of caucus management, and particularly the MP from Labrador and Newfoundland, Ken McDonald, right, who'd been really public in talking about how much he didn't like this, who voted against the carbon tax along with the Conservatives, and had been a really squeaky wheel, I think, on Power and Politics, like most recently, saying, voicing his opposition to this. And if it had been a play for votes in the Atlantic, I think it just more purely strategically that, I think it would have looked a little bit different, because you can't justify getting this amount of votes or whatever you do get out of Atlantic Canada out of pissing off BC so blatantly. Saskatchewan's now come out. Yeah, Saskatchewan's now come out. Northwest Territories the whole opposed both the Scott Moe and the NDP. And then the Northwest Territories, hilariously, who also was sort of like, what the heck, like completely unclear for days about what it even meant for them. So,
well, there was a cleaner hit too if they had said, we understand there's an affordability issue around home heating, and so we're going to increase the carbon tax rebate. They would have protected the carbon tax policy and been more even-handed.
Totally.
But this is where I think the improvisation may have really tripped them up.
Yeah, but I'm going to push back a little, though, in terms of the rebate, because I mean, that's been there for a long time in terms of the revenue neutrality of the carbon tax. Originally, when it was brought in, it was that middle and lower income people were actually probably further ahead with the rebate, but they didn't feel that way because it's coming out of your pocket at the gas pump, and there might be a rebate down the road, right? So I think, you know, they were probably making that argument back to the Liberal MPs who finally said, no, it's not working for us. So I think we're at a point here where, like, what is the future of the carbon tax?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's it may become politically untenable to for governments to stick with it.
Which is an astounding thing to say, Mike. I'm sorry. Came in BC in 2008.
Yeah,
Like
no, it was Gordon Campbell brought it in at a time, was very courageous of him to do so. It was a jiu-jitsu move, frankly. He felt strongly about it. He managed to bring his caucus behind him on it, who didn't see it coming, but they came in behind him. And Geoff, you'll remember, it tied the NDP up in knots.
Yeah.
For that 2009 campaign. So from a political perspective, it worked out really well for Gordon Campbell, and Christie managed to support it and live with it during her time. But now it's the waters have muddied a little bit, a lot actually, since 2008. It was more of a pure revenue neutrality tax when it was brought in, but now there's money from the carbon tax goes here and money from the carbon tax goes there, and it's a lot higher now too.
Well, I agree that's muddy, Mike, but what's clearer is that climate change is a huge problem, and it's costing us like $700 or $800 million in firefighting this year alone. And that, I think, is the huge political conundrum, is to make this feel tangible and real, that I'm making a material contribution somehow to solving this larger problem. What we're seeing instead is people saying, well, we don't want any cap on our gas field emissions. We don't want any of these intrusions are unconstitutional. I agree. It's going to be a big fight. And in BC, where we're struggling to bring down our emissions, the carbon tax and the low carbon fuel standard are the two most material contributors to reducing our emissions. And they're a tiny part of what's a rising cost of fuel, driven very much by global prices and by the profits of the oil companies, who are sitting on billions and billions in profits. So that conversation is going to be a pretty critical one, and it looks like BC will be having it earlier than the federal level, which has triggered this.
I was having a moment yesterday, because I was in Victoria and I sat in for question period, and this consumed a lot of it. And I was having this moment of, holy crap, I'm sitting in the province. I'm one of those people who sat out in Ontario when you guys brought in the carbon tax, thinking like, when are we going to be able to pull that off here? I'm sitting in the province where this was initially introduced, watching this the carbon tax just get tossed around as a real political hot potato, and really seeing people struggle to defend a higher cost on carbon at this moment in time, and just feeling really depressed about it, because it is such a small portion of the overall cost, overall rising costs of particularly home heating oil, but just generally gas, right? I think the Canadian Energy, the clean, what is it called? The CEC put out the stats on this, that it was the increase is sort of 12 cents over the last few years, over the last 3 years, due to the carbon tax federally, and then more like 20 something cents, I think, due to geopolitics and inflation. But the legacy of this is people are going to understand their home heating bills as carbon tax.
Yeah, well, Mike, what does Kevin Falcon do? I mean, on the NDP side, there's a Clean BC plan signed off by the Green Party. So I don't think we're going to see much backpedaling there. But what does Falcon do, who's been a supporter of the carbon tax in the face of?
Well, he's come out and called for the same treatment for BC as Atlantic Canada got. But this is a moment for reflection for BC United. Here's a policy that was brought in by their party, basically BC Liberals, in 2008, and Falcon is quite close with and was a strong supporter of Gordon Campbell. So it's hard to move away from the carbon tax from on that basis, but on a political basis, though, this is a moment where they could potentially redefine how carbon pricing works and possibly separate the consumer away from other forms of carbon pricing, like upstream oil and gas and industrial industrial operations. And I don't know what the political answer is there for them, but it will be a bit appetizing for them, I think, to think maybe we should make a big move here, because that's frankly where a lot of their voters are. But it's it comes potentially with a price, perception on centrist voters or whatever you call it. But I'm just not. I'm not so sure about that. Like it's when you look at the polling over time, carbon tax isn't as popular as people think it is. It's not like when you said earlier, Kate, that the federal government's really pissed BC off. They pissed off the BC government for sure.
Mhm.
I'm not sure they pissed off voters. At
Well, I think
least
that, and the
voters
other
that care about
question is,
affordability.
can you create a credible plan, or do you even need to, Mike, if you're going to be running for provincial office in BC? I
I
mean,
think you need
this
to
is
pass a
something.
test.
Well,
You
when
need
you
to
were,
pass
I
a
mean,
test. Like you have to have a plan of some sort.
well, that's pretty vague. I mean, the reality is,
Gotta
if
have
you
a
don't
story.
use a pricing mechanism, you use regulations. In other words, you don't get to
Yeah.
put in natural gas. A lot more rules are going to happen. I think Mark Jacquard, who David Eby and the government wanted to see at the BC Utilities Commission, comes from that school where why would you do regulations? They're cheap, they're effective, they have an impact. The reality is that whole swaths of the economy are waiting to hear what happens to them in the advancing climate problem, the big battle against climate change. And then we have the situation in Western Canada and in Ontario, where frankly nobody's signing on for carbon pricing or anything else that's really substantive in terms of dealing with climate change. It's a tough one for Falcon, I think, for the points you raised, because he has to repudiate something that he was very much identified with as a front bencher.
So let's move now. Go ahead.
Well, I want to finish on that. Parties have changed their position on the carbon tax before, Jeff.
I know.
You may recall.
I know.
But
after a hard beating at the polls, yeah.
But I think it's at the end of the day, I'm gonna cut you off again, Kate. is that carbon plan? Can it be more transparent? Can it be? Can the public buy into it? Like right now, with what the federal government has done, the coherence of the policy. And Greg Lyle, BC pollster Greg Lyle, had a great LinkedIn post this week on this. The coherence of the carbon pricing policy has taken a bad hit with what the federal government's done. It's going to affect every province that supports it. And this is a moment where somebody might come in and fill the vacuum with some new idea. So we'll see who it is.
We'll watch for that at Hotel Pacifico. Let's move now to the other big piece of news actually yesterday, which was this new coalition, the Save Our Streets coalition with some of BC's largest retailers, London Drugs, Save on Foods, Aritzia, Lululemon, calling on the government to get street crime under control. Were you guys watching this yesterday?
Not closely, and I was a bit confused by it. I thought on the one hand, I was hearing a grassroots group from Nanaimo, and then I was hearing very large corporations, and then I see that actually it's all the same outfit.
Well, it's noteworthy that you have these large companies with retail brands like London Drugs, as you mentioned, Lululemon and so forth, putting their neck out there and expressing strong displeasure with the laws federally and provincially, or how they're being enforced. And you haven't seen a lot of that in the last 6 years while the NDP have governed, where business has, started to voice their public concern. A lot of the discussion's been in the back room, has been settled at tables. Certainly, Jeff, when you were in government, I think it was a hallmark of your government that you managed to have those conversations inside the premier's office as opposed to on the front lawn of the legislature. But now, there's a different tone coming out of that, at least with this group here, where they're frustrated and, they've hired the PR firm, not my PR firm, but they've hired a PR firm, and they're going to make some noise.
It's a mishmash to me, Kate, of issues that we keep hearing about that are all now put into one single bundle, and I'm not quite sure how government's going to respond to it, because shoplifting and violence around stores and so on is unfortunately a familiar scenario. It was a big problem, and especially in the early days of the pandemic, where staff had to, these stores had to hire a lot of security, not because of shoplifting, but because of risk of violence to staff who were trying to regulate purchases and keep people distanced and that kind of thing. So these big companies have a lot of experience in this regard, and if they're seeing it go off the charts like that, as they say they are, I'm sure it's true. That's a troubling and different phenomenon from street addicts, from people suffering from substance abuse disorders, living in a homeless situation on the street. They're quite different, but they're being put together, and I think it makes it tough to solve. I'm not quite sure what solution they're looking for beyond shoving at the legislature.
I think that's a really interesting distinction, Geoff. Like that's what I was looking at it to say, like what specifically are they asking for? And particularly if you're going to kind of lay it at the door of the premier, I think it's a good place to come with a sort of clear ask or some clear ideas or a discussion you want to have about how to fix it. It's a little more at this point. This is a huge problem and we're sounding the alarm bell. Maybe it'll evolve from there, but we'll have to see.
It's going to be a big issue one way or the other because it goes like the carbon tax one to some core concerns people have. You can't walk around the streets of any of our cities or towns. This used to be true in downtown Vancouver. It's now true almost everywhere in BC without encountering people in extreme hardship living on the street and wrestling with very, very severe substance abuse disorders. It's really a heartbreaking thing to see, but obviously very difficult to manage and not unique to BC. It's happening across the entire Pacific seaboard in many cities across North America, but not notably in some other parts of the world. So people are right to be upset and angry. Whether there's a solution from this direction, I'm not sure.
What are the other parts of the world you're thinking of, Geoff?
Well, we were able to visit Europe in the spring and wander all over London and some major cities in Italy, and we simply didn't observe street homelessness. I don't know what the reasons are for that, but in London, that was not the case some time ago. I know that on the western seaboard of the United States, you can read it in the Seattle Times, the San Francisco Examiner, so it's very, very acute there.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, I think on this issue, Premier Eby has been fairly effective over the last year in getting just ahead of some issues and kind of leading the parade on the media coverage. Like he has talked about being tougher and getting federal support for cracking down on repeat offenders and that type of thing. But a lot of that it seems very communications focused strategy. And it's the what's behind it is the hard part. And, I think this coalition is an example of here's a group of businesses that they're not willing to wait for the platitudes here. They want to see real progress here. And there are other issues like that too, that as time ticks on, it will be a bigger challenge for the EB government to keep pace with events, as Geoff was talking about events last time, keep pace with events and have meaningful policy responses to them, not just strong communication responses to them. So proof will be in the pudding.
This area, Mike, and you'll be familiar with this. Kim Boland had an exclusive in the Vancouver Sun a month or so ago. She had FOI'd redacted. She got it redacted, but it was the report done at the request of the government by the police services in the wake of a very, very sharp spike in the gang warfare about a year and a half ago. And what was left to see, it was a lot redacted, showed that there was complete lack of coordination on the police side against gang warfare. And so for community organizations like this coalition to demand something be done proposes that there be stronger political oversight or direction of policing efforts, which, as you and I know, Mike, is not how it works. You're not allowed to do it. So, the button that some folks would like the government to push is not connected to anything because there's no political oversight of policing and there's significant lack of coordination. It's a profound issue, which is going to have to be confronted one of these days. The report is sort of public, but enough is public to show that the government's got a huge problem in this regard and no easy way to get at it.
Well, you've got Crown Council, you've got policing, you've got corrections, you've got drug treatment, you've got mental health services, and they're all, they don't appear to be well coordinated. And, this is the challenge when we talked about it last time, which is how do you pull all that together in a seamless way? And it's practically impossible to do, but you're going to be held accountable for having to try to do it. And right now it's public's pretty frustrated.
It would be a great outcome to see this coalition move towards developing what could be the next steps on this, because I think that's the problem. I think you said it, Geoff, there's no button. There's a button with nothing attached to it on this one. We need to find a button.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
I'll start this week. I'd like to raise a glass. I'd like to raise a glass to MLA Ben Stewart, who announced this past week he is going to retire after the next election. And I want to be specific. I'm raising a glass of the 2017 Dijon Clone Pinot Noir from Quail's Gate. But why I'm particularly signaling out Ben, and I know there's other MLAs that have announced they're retiring as well, and I honor all of them who served. But Ben, it's the second time he's stepped away from provincial office. The first time was when Christy Clark needed a seat following the 2013 election. And I can tell you, it's not easy to get incumbent MLAs and save seats to give up their seats. But in Ben's case, he had no hesitation in making room for Premier to fulfill her mandate. So that's why I'm raising a glass to Ben. Thanks for a great career.
I got a shot. I'm in a more annoyed mood today about this because up and coming political talent in the Metro Vancouver area, Mayor Brad West of Port Coquitlam, was commenting about the big debate at Metro Vancouver last week, where they tried to figure out whether or not they should defer some increases in development charges so that the federal government would give them hundreds of millions of dollars for housing, or whether they should just go ahead with the development charges. So of course, Sean Fraser, housing minister in Ottawa, is holding back the money. And Mayor West said to reporters that the whole thing felt akin to a hostage taking. No, Mayor West, we are not going to use similes like hostage taking at this time. And if that had happened in a scrum in the legislature or in a bigger league, I think there would have been more discussion about it. So that's my shot. I just think that Mayor West got lots of ability and smarts. He should dial up his rhetoric checker before he uses some of these terms.
All right, a glass and a shot. If you'll both indulge me a bit, I do want to get a bit serious. I feel like this is the light segment of the show. But in my, I want to raise a glass today, and it is something just a bit more somber, because I want to raise a glass to Matthew Perry, the actor from Friends who passed away recently. And I want to raise a glass to him because he was really public all his life about his struggles with addictions. And in his memoir, he talked about the time when he was about 10 years old, which is the age of my son. And his mother went to go work as press secretary to Pierre Trudeau. And he talked about how when she went away to that job, how he felt like a latchkey kid in many ways. And that was sort of beginning of a lot of troubles for him. And I want to raise a glass to Matthew and to his mom, because over the years, I've had so many conversations. I went through this myself when I was in politics. I've had so many conversations with staffers who have young families, really struggling with that decision about whether it's the right decision for their family. And there's no right answer. I don't have, I've had these conversations so many times. There's no yes or no, but I have to say that headline and that news hit me hard. And I want to raise a glass. I'm going to even expand it now to Matthew, to his mom, and to everyone who struggles with that decision. And to those who, whatever decision you make, cheers to you.
I'd like to thank our guests at Hotel Pacifico for stopping by this week for the West Coast Political Conversation, and to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, for supporting great dialogue taking place to inform public affairs in British Columbia. Come next week. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.